Hi, Misha here, and welcome to one of the rarer 172 scale diecast models in my collection. And while the model's not perfect, it's what I've got, and I'm very happy with it. We already talked about the Mirage 2000 and the Mirage 2000 5F here, and recently visited the Mirage 3 and 5. But in between them, we had the Dassault Mirage F1. Interesting series with a very interesting history and kind of middling production. We had over 1,400 Mirage 3Cs. We had a little under 600 Mirage 5s. Well, we had a little over 700 F1s and their variants. But interestingly, these get used a lot in combat. I think it was just the right plane at the right time. It's a combat use in Africa, the Middle East, and elsewhere, and served the French. Actually, a few times it actually served both sides of the war. For example, in 1991 during the Gulf War. Actually, three sides if you count Kuwait. Oh my. It's quite interesting. It's also interesting that they went from a delta wing to a more traditional wing and tail, back to a delta wing. But you can actually see elements of the F1 in the 2000 series. So with no further ado, let's go back to the 60s and start off with the very convoluted beginnings of the F1. And convoluted is right. Actually, the F1 started off as an internal, privately funded project at Dassault, and a second or even third tier stringer at that. No, their primary ones were the F2 and the F3. The F2 was a strike aircraft, and the F3 was more of a dedicated interceptor. And they wanted something to replace the Mirage 3 and what will become the Mirage 5 in the catalog. But, they had these initial concepts in 64, but 65 there were some budget things. And then in 66, the F2 would actually fly, a prototype would. And then later that year, the prototype F1 would, or rather, an early version known as the M50. The second prototype, which would be more like the F1, would fly in March of 1967. The French Air Force, well, they had several concepts. Originally, they were wanting a swing wing design, and in the beginning, they thought about kind of partnering with Britain for what would become ultimately the Panavia Tornado, but that didn't go anywhere. They would partner, of course, to make the Jaguar, which was a strike aircraft, which did go into production and was quite successful. So, they thought they might need a more modern, high-speed interceptor. Dassault, yeah. Again, the F3 was the interceptor, the F2 was the strike fighter. First, the F2 got knocked out. The French thought, we've got the Jaguar, we don't really need the F2. Okay, fine. So F1, F3. Dassault starts building the F3 prototype, but maybe a little illogically, the French Air Force is more interested in the F1, which the prototype, the design was more of a multi-role fighter. Of course, it could be tweaked a bit to make it more of an interceptor, but it was designed to be a fighter bomber, an attack craft, a true dogfighter. Nevertheless, that's what the French government was kind of pursuing. In fact, they made this official in May of 1969 by saying that they planned to buy about 100 of them. But let's go back a bit. So there were 3 prototypes ultimately from Dassault, including ground test, and the French would order back in 67 3 pre-production models. The first one would fly in 68, the second one in 69, the third one in 1970. It's one each year. And incrementally they got better and better. Why didn't they want the F3? Well, no one really knows. The prototype was abandoned, it never even flew. But it's speculated that maybe the French thought that the F1 would be more desirable for export markets. They were correct, probably. They also thought it was a more flexible design. Again, probably correct. And they maybe thought about the economy. Definitely correct. At any rate, in 1969, Dassault began tooling up for full rate production, and in 1971, the French Air Force confirmed an initial order of 85 was actually in the hand, done, signed for, and these would be F1C variants, which were fighter interceptor versions for the French Air Force. And that gets us to this one here. Taking this Falcon F1C off the stand, at first this might seem a radical departure from the Mirage 3, but it's not maybe as much as you'd think. The actual fuselage is very much the same. The difference is with the wing. This is a high-mounted wing, very much at the top. And we have a very traditional tail assembly here. We still have a single French-made engine. And they did this to improve maneuverability, needing a shorter runway to take off and land with. And it could hold more fuel and thus more range. In fact, the F1 had about a 40% better range, requiring about a 25% shorter runway, sometimes 30 depending on the variant. Yeah, and this engine was based on the Mirage 3s, but was considered more reliable, dependable, and more fuel efficient. It also had additional hard points underneath. Remember, originally the Mirage 3 had 3, then 5. This actually has a total of 7, although not as much as you might think. There's a center line, that's the heaviest one, that can carry over 4,500 pounds. The two inner ones are the main underwing hardpoints. They're also plumbed along with the center. They can carry nearly 3,000 pounds each. The two outboards under the wings are not all that useful, frankly. They, if anything, when they were being used, they carried chaff or flare pods, jammer pods, kind of auxiliary equipment. This one doesn't really come with anything, which is actually correct for a 1979 or so French Air Force example. They were not plumbed, and they really couldn't carry a whole lot of weight. And then, of course, the outboard wingtips, those were for short-range air-to-air defense missiles. Initially, they would use the Sidewinder, but very quickly they would transition to the Magic missile. This would also use the same French M530 missile, M530, medium range, and then later it'd be the Super 530 as improved versions came up to date. That also would have a parachute in the back, all kinds of stuff. Lots of changes would happen to the design. So it could carry more. Technically, it could carry over 13,000 pounds payload, but practically speaking, you're looking at about 9,000 pounds. So about the same as the Mirage 3, Mirage 5, at least later versions. But we also have the same top speed of about Mach 2.2. And we have a slightly higher max altitude of over 60,000 feet. So there are a lot of benefits. The cockpit's more modernized and updated, if you will. It has dual wheels for each of the 3 landing gears for better rough airfield performance. It's just overall a much more mature design than the 3 and even the 5. And it had a Sereno Mark IV radar set based on the Mark II and Mark III from earlier on. The initial version was pretty much interceptor only, but the Mark IV-1 had limited look-down, shoot-down capability for ground attack. It would be integrated in certain versions and variants, but the one originally made for the French, the F1C, was in fact the ground attacker. Now dimensionally, this is actually very similar to the Mirage 3. It's just over 50 feet long, so just slightly longer. It has a wingspan of just under 28 feet, so slightly wider. But yeah, not a much heavier aircraft, but it carries more fuel. And it's just a better performer, especially at lower altitudes and speeds, and it doesn't need the crazy runway. By the way, it still has 2 30mm cannon like the Mirage 3, and these actually hold up to 150 shells now. And it can carry up to 3 external drop tanks, plus it has more internal fuel, giving it much better range endurance. Just, more effective aircraft. So quite impressive. This one here is in the pretty standard air defense configuration with 2 medium range missiles, 2 short range, and it does come with the centerline fuel tank. For longer range missions, they would have to give up the 2 inner missiles. These couldn't be mounted on the external hardpoints, so if we wanted fuel tanks here, we'd have to give those up. And again, the outer hardpoints under the wings are really just for pods, jammers, what have you. Initially, this could not use laser-guided munitions, but later versions would actually have the ability to do that. So yeah, let's talk about some French service. Exciting. The French Air Force would receive the F1C in 2 major batches. The first one consisted of 83 production aircraft from May of 1973 through February of 1977. And the second batch, which was a little bit different, consisted of 79 aircraft from March of 77 through 1983. They ended up with a total of 162 production planes, plus those pre-production aircraft that they ordered. There were changes from the very outset, but let's go back. The first ones were given over to squadrons to work up at the end of 73, reaching initial operational readiness in 1974, and moving into 75, becoming their primary interceptor. It's pretty obvious why this was better than the Mirage 3. It was economical, had just all the better performance. But it got better. With the 71st aircraft, they added a radar warning receiver. Originally, they did not really have any countermeasures. And then with the 84th aircraft, the first one of the second run, these are called F1C 200s, and these had the option of aerial refueling. A socket was placed in the nose where a fixed refueling probe for the air could be added. Essentially, it looked like the one over here on the, wherever I put it, the Mirage 2000. Kind of an iconic thing, at least in my mind, of French aircraft, that little canted to the side. And like I said, they would go from the 4 to the 4-1 radar with better ground attack abilities, and they would continue to update these throughout the production run and service. Initially, the one stationed in France had kind of a blue-gray, blue-white top with a light gray bottom. But when they get to the field, they would be changed up a bit. And towards the end of the F1C 200 run, there would be another variant, the F1CR, a reconnaissance version. Now, the standard aircraft had 2 cannon. The F1C gave one of those up to make room, had 1 cannon, and it could be fitted with reconnaissance pods and what have you, and it had fairings for different cameras under the nose. It also had a pretty respectable secondary ground attack capability. Now, these initially really weren't meant for guided weapons, but they could carry a much wider range and heavier payload further of unguided bombs, rockets, what have you. Their first French combat deployment would come in 1984, when these would go to Chad. And they would fly escort missions with the Jaguars, also reconnaissance missions. The reconnaissance version would first appear just a year earlier in 83, be into service. They would be sent home to France and then go back to Chad in 86 and then fly back. Now, aircraft that were sent to Africa tended to have a sand or mud top with a gray bottom, and the reconnaissance aircraft had more of a gray, green, brown top and a gray bottom. So different, schemes. And they would also acquire 20 of the F1D model, or excuse me, F1B model, which was a two-seat version. It eliminated the cannon, and it was primarily purchased for training. However, they found it was actually quite useful if they mounted a laser designator pod on it for strike missions, letting the backseater kind of handle that. So it had a combat role. By the way, they acquired about 62 reconnaissance versions. In fact, France was the only customer for the F1CR, so that was kind of special for them. So pretty respectable numbers in service, about 250. Not quite as many as the Mirage 3, but it was a better aircraft in many ways. And it was designed to be easy to maintain, quick turnaround for missions. And after a couple of years of working out, typical bugs, it was well liked by the 1980s. And its next major French combat use would be right before the Gulf War. In 1990, they would station about a dozen of these in Qatar to provide air defense. And 4 would be stationed in Saudi Arabia to do overflight missions of Iraq after their invasion of Kuwait. Now, funnily enough, in January of 1991, when the war kicked off and went hot with Desert Storm, for the first couple of weeks, the French F-1s were grounded because Iraq was also flying them, and they didn't want an incident. But eventually, on January 26th, they were allowed to fly missions, and they would fly over 114. They were used for reconnaissance, of course. They were also used for escort, and they were used quite effectively as strike fighters, fighter bombers, what have you. By this point, they were not new technology. The Mirage 2000Cs were just coming into full service. And actually, numbers in the French Air Force had started to decline at the late 80s because they were anticipating the new Rafale. But, as you know from the Rafale video, it was delayed. So instead, they would kind of work with what they had, and it's a good thing they had the Mirage 2000C as well. Now, this Falcon model is the F1C from the French Air Force, 1979. So it's not an F1C 200, it's actually an F1C original production. It's pretty neat though, I like it, gear up or down. Again, it's not the best model as far as authenticity, the nose isn't the perfect shape, but beggars can't be choosers, and at one time these were quite inexpensive, but don't look on eBay, they're terrifyingly expensive now. And it does have opening canopy, and I modified a Hobby Master guy to fit. Luckily this time I didn't have to give him butt surgery like I did for the Mirage 3 and Kefir. All I had to do was trim his little feet a bit, so he's a little stubby on the feet. Otherwise, you can tell it is a much more widespread cockpit. By the way, these had Martin Baker licensed production ejection seats. Originally, it was a 0 altitude, but it was not 0 speed. Needed to be going about 80-90 miles per hour to get back to the future. To eject safely. But very soon, this was upgraded to a true 00, first the Mark 6 and later the Mark 10 seat. Again, made in France under license. Like I said, these used the Magic missile in the 530 and later Super 530. Plus, the reconnaissance versions had their pods and often chaff and flare, all that good stuff. So the Iraq War really showed that the old dogs had some life in it. In 92, they actually deployed some of these to Turkey to ensure that Saddam wouldn't do mean things to the Kurds and just, generally support Allied operations. Now, Dassault ended the F1 production line in 1990, although it would take them a couple of years to fully wrap things up, building planes from parts. Officially, it was over in 92. But also around the exact same time period, a decision was taken in France to upgrade and refurbish 55 F1Cs to F1CT standard. This was to make them more of a true ground attack aircraft, and just generally speaking, upgrade the airframe. They would refurbish the airframe, giving it more life, strengthening it for the ground attack role. They would receive updated chaff and flare. They would get a new radar warning system. They would get infrared and a laser designator. This would actually require that one of the cannon be removed for the F1CT. Just the general things. They would get a new cockpit, new digital kind of control system. Nothing major, but just making them a little bit more capable and, generally speaking, just refurbishing them. And they started to be able to carry more guided munitions. They often use the F1Bs, like I said, for designated laser pods. And the first ones were delivered in '92, and the last ones a couple of years later. The F1CRs were also updated. New pods were installed in the late 90s. They got the same airframe update. They also lost their one 30mm cannon, meaning they had none, but this was to give way to new sensors and equipment to make them more capable. And yeah, the F1CT was just a stopgap measure so they could retire older strike aircraft and until the refuel was ready to go. You know, the Mirage 2000Cs were updated to 2005Fs as well. So it's just, you know, because of the end of the Cold War and budget cuts in France, and because of the war in the Gulf showing that the aircraft was still capable, it gave it a life extension. Probably the last time the F1CT took part in major combat would be in 2007, when some F1s were sent to Kandahar, Afghanistan, along with Mirage 2000s to fly escort missions, strike missions, and of course reconnaissance missions. It wouldn't be long after this, though, that the F1CTs would be retired. The last squadron would be flying them as reconnaissance aircraft, although they still had that secondary ground attack capability. These would be used in 2011 in Libya during that incident. And that would be the last major use of the reconnaissance version. It'd be stationed here and there a few other times, but finally it would be retired from service in 2014, finally with the Rafale coming into full service and the 2005Fs being available. And interestingly, in 2017, the French started selling several of these off as surplus to private companies that use these for various training and demonstration. Most would go to the USA, but a few would actually go to South Africa. And speaking of, yeah, that's the story in the French Air Force, but like I said originally, this was designed for export as much as anything else. And it definitely has an interesting history, I'll give you that. I do wish I had more versions to show you. I'm just happy to have this one, though. Falcon did do the reconnaissance, and I think I know they did the F1C200. They might have done the F1CT. But before they could get really deep into the line, they got shut down. They did a few foreigners. But really, like I said, the first ones were delivered in '73 to the French Air Force. Already by '74, there was a major foreign customer. That would be South Africa. And in '75, there would be two major customers to note. Spain, which would ultimately purchase 75 or so, and Greece, which would purchase over 100. The Greek ones are actually kind of rushed into Greece between '75 and '78 because of rising tensions with Turkey. And probably the most interesting user came about in the '80s. That would be Iraq. I should say that Kuwait acquired two batches of F1s, one in '77, the second one in '83. And they would have about 3 dozen total. For export, there was the F1A, which was a day fighter, essentially. There was, of course, the F1B, the two-seater, was offered for export. The F1C was pretty much just for the French. The F1D was a two-seat version for export, and the F1E was the main export model, which was more of a multi-role fighter, very similar to the F1C, frankly. But as usual, Dassault was perfectly happy to customize for foreign orders. So Kuwait got some, and Iraq would follow suit, getting quite a large number, about 93, I believe, single-seaters and 15 two-seaters between 1980 and 1988. And you know they used these during their war with Iran. They claimed to have shot down 35 Iranian aircraft with these. They lost at least 7, plus several more damaged severely at times. They do say that one F1 Iraqi plane shot down an F-14A. Quite interesting. They also used these for ground attack to hit Iranian troops and armor. And they even had some set up to fire the Exocet missile, which Iraq used to try to hit tankers in the Gulf. But this was not terribly successful. Because of political situations, Iraq wanted more. First, they couldn't pay. Second, the political situation deteriorated, so 88 would be the end of them. But some of them were still quite new when the Gulf War kicked off. And Iraq did fly them. Interestingly, Kuwait had some of theirs still. They were flying. Of course, France had theirs. The Iraqis had the dubious distinction of an Iraqi F1 being the first Iraqi aircraft lost in the air, shot down by an Allied F-15. Ultimately, they would lose 9 in the air. Many more would flee to Iran, where they would be seized by the Iranians. And in fact, one Iraqi F-1 is credited by being downed by an unarmed EF-111A Raven, which is an interesting story in and of itself. These days, it may or may not be true, but it's a fun story. It's worth pointing out that the Iraqis mostly use French ordnance, but others, like Greece, tended to like the Sidewinder, the AIM-9. Again, happy to configure however they wanted. But by the 90s, foreign orders were pretty well over. But still, yeah, over 450 aircraft were for the foreign contracts, and they did not just see use in the Middle East combat. They saw some limited use in South America and border skirmishes, and of course in Africa. It was a good aircraft for its day and time, and ended up being kind of a surprise success for Dassault, because the F1 was second choice, or even third choice after the F2 and F3. Heck, there was even the G8, which ended up going nowhere. So it's kind of a miracle it made it into production at all. But, yeah, kind of neat it did. Let's wrap this up. And that kind of completes our major lineup of the Mirage aircraft. And we've talked about the Rafale as well. Quite interesting. Of course, Hobbymaster is by far a much better aircraft, but at least Falcon made these. Maybe one day someone else will. The tooling, knowing China, is out there somewhere for both of these. And again, the models aren't perfect, especially the Falcon ones, but these were not $200 models when they came out. They were $30, $40 models at most. So for that time, yeah, they were fine. They did well. And the F1 is often overlooked because it is kind of an outlier, the odd one out in the Mirage series. But even though there weren't near as many users of it as the 3, it just had a knack for getting into combat. I don't know, it just maybe the right plane at the right time. But it has quite the combat record. And it served the French themselves very well, especially the reconnaissance variant. And was a good aircraft, all things considered. So, let me know what you think. As always, if you could, please like, share, subscribe. And if you could, check out my previous videos on these. This is Misha, and I'll catch you very soon after dinner next time.